The 2000s delivered a golden age of gaming. Massive technical leaps in hardware and online connectivity, multiple successful consoles from each of the big three, exploding game production values and scope, as well as both quantity and quality delivered across a variety of genres. This was truly a remarkable time to be a gamer. If you were to ask fans of that decade what the defining genre of the time was, most would probably respond with first or third person shooters, thanks to juggernauts like Call of Duty, Halo, Gears, and Uncharted. However, there's one other genre that was absolutely firing on all cylinders during the 2000s like no other decade in gaming, and that was the racing genre.
You're not going to believe some of the opportunities coming our way.
In 2025, when racing games often feel forgotten or like an industry afterthought kept alive by a few surviving tentpole franchises, it's almost difficult to even describe how massive this genre was at the time. So in this video, let's rewind back to the starting line around the year 2000 and explore the pinnacle of this genre all the way to the decade finish line around 2009 or 2010. Along the way, we'll also examine the staggering quantity, quality, and variety of titles delivered over those years. We'll look at technical comparisons to understand just how far the genre progressed in a short time, and revisit important titles that really delivered a nitro boost to the genre. As a side note, most of the games in this video are original copies captured on original hardware. I think that's important for this type of video. I'll do my best to show the game title, captured platform, and year of release the first time it's shown, so you can tell if it's original or a re-release or port. If you enjoy this content, please consider hitting those subscribe and like buttons, and let's race. Let's start by just crunching some numbers here in terms of franchises and release count to highlight the scope of operations during this time period. These numbers will vary depending on how you count these games. Racing games are notorious for remixes, remasters, ports, prologues, enhanced editions, regional exclusives, and so on. This won't be a perfect tally, but it will give you a sense of what we're dealing with here. So during the 2000s, we received a whopping 10 core Need for Speed games, annual releases every single year across various consoles and handhelds, and that annual release cadence went on for quite a while. We also received 7 Burnout games, an incredible franchise that unfortunately burned out by the end of the decade, aside from the smaller scale release of Burnout Crash and a Burnout Paradise remaster, of course. Both the Ridge Racer series and the Midnight Club franchise each delivered about a half a dozen games or so. Gran Turismo received a whopping 5 to 10 releases depending on how you count iterations like the prologue and concept releases. The kart racing subgenre was also thriving. The Mario Kart franchise saw 4 full-size releases across handhelds and consoles, which sounds crazy today given that we've only had one Mario Kart release in the last 14 years now. Meaning Mario Kart 8 is still the only entry since Mario Kart 7 in 2011. And the Crash Bandicoot kart racing games also received 3 entries from late 99 to 2005. Forza Motorsport saw 3 releases and is arguably one of the only major racing franchises from the 2000s to actually grow in prevalence and release cadence over time. F-Zero received 3 releases between handhelds and GameCube, and also sadly never made it to the end of the decade outside of F-Zero 99 and some Switch Online ports. The 2000s are really a graveyard of incredible yet abandoned racing franchises. We also received 4 Wipeout games, 2 entries in the Extreme series, multiple entries in the wider Dirt franchise, and even an entry from the Grid racing franchise towards the end of the decade. The list goes on. Wave Race Blue Storm delivered a stunning successor tech demo for the GameCube. The Asphalt Racing series, now a mobile device mainstay that also sometimes releases on consoles, actually got its start during this decade on the Nintendo DS and PSP. Licensed racing games also received many entries, nearly a dozen NASCAR and just as many MotoGP racing games, endless movie tie-in racing games. I could go on. The racing genre was so popular, even many non-racing franchises ended up getting their own racing games. For example, Jack X Combat Racing ditched platforming entirely and replaced it with vehicular madness. We also received some niche racing classics like Kirby's Air Ride, and actually multiple racing games from the Sonic franchise, which admittedly had dabbled in racing games in the 90s and such. And what better game to end this list with than the bizarre, motion-controlled Wii launch title, Excite Truck. Despite the sheer volume of racing games released, What's even more surprising is how many titles on this list were also of very high quality. Flawless arcade classics like F-Zero GX, Burnout 3 Takedown, or really any of the Burnouts, solid Need for Speed titles like Underground 2, Shift, or Hot Pursuit entries, these were fast, furious, and polished. Forza and Gran Turismo pushed the bar for what simulation racers could deliver in terms of realism and scope. Mario Kart DS was a classic, and combined with Mario Kart Wii, reached many millions of new players. Towards the end of the decade, we even started to see quality, large, open-world racing games like Burnout Paradise and Midnight Club Los Angeles. Need for Speed also went open world right after the decade ended with a new rendition of Most Wanted. It's also critical to understand just how far the racing genre progressed during this time technologically in terms of visuals and gameplay. These were generational jumps like we'll never see again in the industry. For example, at the tail end of 1999, Gran Turismo 2 released for the PS1, and in many ways this was a technical marvel for the year and hardware. Keep in mind, the PS1 only had roughly a 33 MHz processor and a couple megabytes of memory. Today's computers are thousands and thousands of times more powerful. This game is somehow still fairly playable today and looks alright with the proper setup if you appreciate it for what it is. However, around the tail end of the decade, we already had Gran Turismo 5, and if we compare these two visually, you can see just what a massive jump in fidelity there really was. If you were to fast forward another 10 years of Gran Turismo, the jump is nowhere near as significant. I think the Need for Speed franchise arguably saw just as impressive of growth. For example, here we have Need for Speed Porsche Unleashed running on the PS1 again, the first entry in the new century, although honestly one of my least favorite games in the series. If we compare that to something like Need for Speed Shift, the difference here is just staggering. It's easy to forget how vast of a difference 2 generations used to deliver. These types of visual leaps were common across franchises during the time, and it didn't always take 2 generations. For example, here's Wipeout Fusion running on PS2 from early 2002. Although this is arguably the weakest entry in the series, it's still shocking to see this replaced with Wipeout HD on the PS3. These games are only 6 years apart, if you can believe it. Nowadays, racing games, or really games from any genre, are often graphically indistinguishable if they're only several years apart like this. This jump is even crazier if we compare Wipeout 3 from late 1999. Although I think this is a great PS1 title, when we compare that again to Wipeout HD, the difference is sort of mind-boggling. Even just comparing Hot Pursuit 2 on PS2 to the Hot Pursuit reboot on PS3, this was a huge leap for a single generation. If you go back and play these games, you might also be surprised to discover the high image quality of some of them, particularly the rare gems that run at 1080p 60 FPS, such as Ridge Racer 7 and Gran Turismo 5. 60 FPS helps a lot even for 720p games like Burnout Paradise, or even 480p games like F-Zero GX and Mario Kart Double Dash. The smooth frame rate helps them to age more gracefully than extra pixels would. In general though, one of the biggest weaknesses of the 360 and PS3 generation is the common presentation standard of 720p at 30 FPS, which looks fine, but is a bit grainy for detailed worlds and not optimally fluid. As a quick random tangent, perhaps the only racing game series that I think actually regressed during this decade is Mario Kart. I always thought that Mario Kart Wii actually looked and played worse than Double Dash, despite being released several years later on slightly more powerful hardware. I personally think Double Dash is actually one of the best entries in the series, and that Mario Kart Wii is one of the worst, but very few people seem to share this opinion, so I digress. The technological advancements applied far beyond visuals as well. In the late 90s or the year 2000, online racing for console games was basically non-existent, yet by the end of the decade, we had full open worlds with extensive online interactivity, communities, and racing experiences designed entirely around competition with friends and strangers alike. Gameplay evolved to feature much more advanced physics systems and extremely nuanced fine-tuning of car behaviors and performance. Racing games could be continuously expanded, for better or worse, through the introduction of microtransactions and DLC packs. In best case scenarios, this helped games to feel more like living experiences, and in worst cases, well, here we are today. The 2000s technically saw 3 different console generations, and each one delivered a meaningful evolution for the racing genre beyond any generational leap we've seen since. The PS1 and N64 were the first mainstream game consoles to render true 3D visuals for racing games. No longer were racetracks limited to pixel art and tricks to simulate 3D motion. Worlds came alive in 3D around you, and vehicles were no longer limited to animated sprites, instead replaced by full 3D models. Although the year 2000 marks the tail end of this generation, it's important to remember that this technological jump to 3D in the late 90s over systems like the SNES was equally mind-blowing as anything that followed, if not more so. The year 2000 and late 1999 said goodbye to the generation with classic titles like the aforementioned Gran Turismo 2, Wipeout 3, Ridge Racer 64, Star Wars Episode 1 Racer, and of course the annual Need for Speed titles. 2000 was also the launch year of the PS2 ahead of GameCube and Xbox, so we saw an early peek at the next generation with games like Ridge Racer 5. These games delivered a great sense of speed, fun tracks, and refined gameplay for the time. The PS2, Xbox, and GameCube provided the next big leap. Games evolved from rough, pixelated approximations of 3D worlds to more beautiful environments that started to mirror the real world much more closely. Franchises like Gran Turismo and Forza began to deliver truly convincing simulations. Environments were larger, more dynamic, and more detailed. Games became more complex, with plenty of modes, options, customizations, progression systems, and more. Franchises like F-Zero began to use the increased power to deliver unparalleled speed and beautiful visuals. This generation also began to improve gameplay and world interactivity. Systems like extensive car damage began to surface, much more on this later. And finally, the jump to the PS3 and 360 was equally impressive, and the Wii was interesting in its own way as well. This was the generation when racing games started to approach photorealism and extensive online connectivity became the norm. Environments became highly detailed and more interactive. The consoles were powerful enough to offer better-looking, richer open worlds, and racing games immediately began to experiment more with this concept, such as Burnout Paradise. Racing games are always a great showcase for the power of these new systems. In fact, I would argue that a good number of PS3 and 360 racing games do not look that fundamentally different even from modern console racing games almost 20 years later. For example, if we look at this footage of Need for Speed Shift again, I think this game looks really far ahead of its time. This game is 16 years old now, but it still looks and feels like a modern racer for the most part. Diminishing returns began to rapidly plague this genre ever since the year 2010 or so, and that's true of broader gaming as well. It's also worth mentioning that games towards the end of the PS3 and 360 lifecycle look even better, such as Shift 2 Unleashed, Gran Turismo 6, Need for Speed Most Wanted, and Forza Horizon, but those games are a bit outside of our focused time frame here. This idea of diminishing returns is evident in some of the few racing games that were remastered in later years. For instance, 2010's Hot Pursuit was a stunning looking game at the time for an arcade racer. This is probably my favorite Need for Speed game, maybe somewhat controversially. I love the simplistic yet polished gameplay loop, great sense of speed, and lack of any extraneous bloat or tedious systems. I'm usually not a fan of open-world racing games actually. I think they sacrifice racing precision and accessibility in favor of bloated mechanics and checklists, but that's a topic for another video. Hot Pursuit features beautiful environments, decent collision damage, time of day changes, weapon and device effects, and tons of high-octane action with a lot going on during the incredible chase sequences. When this game was remastered a full 10 years later, some complained that it was barely an upgrade. However, I think the remastered Hot Pursuit is still one of the better-looking arcade racers you can buy even today, despite only having minimal changes, so this complaint is really just a testament to the original design. I think this game actually looks better than Need for Speed Heat and other franchise entries from the time, though obviously it's more limited in scope. Burnout Paradise was also a good-looking game for an early world racer. Although the environment lacks elements such as weather or day-night cycles, it did run at 60 FPS, and it's still an attractive game that required only a moderate update in the 2018 remaster. I was hoping this remaster meant more Burnout was on the way, but unfortunately that turned out to not be the case. Still, it's impressive to see a lightly remastered game hold up so well. Now, we've discussed how the 2000s racing genre holds up well against modern games, but I would argue that in some ways it actually surpasses modern offerings beyond just the number of titles available. When I went back and played all these games for this video, I was surprised at how many of them feature extensive car damage. That's in stark contrast to today's modern racers, many of which tend to shy away from damage simulation almost entirely in favor of overly static visuals that emphasize fidelity over interactivity, a problem that extends beyond just the racing genre. Major titles like Forza and Gran Turismo still offer limited or no car damage, certainly not to the extent that we used to see in other franchises like Burnout. Some of these restrictions are due to manufacturer licensing. They don't want to see their cars demolished, especially not inaccurately. There's also the argument that when games look this realistic, creating car damage visuals would be enormously complex and time-consuming and just not worth the budget. However, I think that simply highlights that some areas of gaming technology have not progressed nearly as fast as others. For example, photorealism progressed much faster than simulations and dynamics and physics. Again, this is a common issue in the industry well beyond just racing games. Back in the 2000s, though, many of these games had impressive damage systems. The Burnout series in particular was known for crunching and shredding cars during race takedowns. These damage and crumple visuals on the PS2 are arguably better than what we see in many racing games today. Hot Pursuit 2010 also has fairly impressive damage mechanics, which shouldn't be surprising given that it was developed by Criterion and is a Burnout game in everything but name. If you pay attention while playing this game, you'll notice that even other random cars and traffic around you have pretty good collision damage and physics, not just the racers and cops. This is the type of thing I'd love to see more of in today's games. The 2000s racing genre also has a lot to offer that is almost nowhere to be found today besides just crumpling cars and damage physics. I think one of the great tragedies of the modern racing genre is the near total death of major sci-fi arcade racers, meaning outside of the indie or Steam community. F-Zero, Wipeout, Extreme, none of these franchises survive to the modern day. Even some of the slightly more modern series, such as the Fast racing series on Wii U and Switch, seem to have disappeared as well. It's easy to forget that the Fast series technically hasn't seen a new release in 8 years now. Perhaps the closest surviving franchise we have out there right now is Redout, which delivered a great sequel in 2022, but there was simply a far greater variety back in the 2000s. It is great to see sci-fi racers live on in indie titles like Aero GPX, which is a fun attempt at a spiritual successor to F-Zero GX, and other titles like Flashout. However, most of these games, while valiant efforts, don't quite capture the big production values and scope of titles like Wipeout HD or F-Zero GX. One other unique element of the 2000s was the numerous handheld exclusive racing games. This is almost hard to relate to in 2025 when dedicated handheld-only games and systems from major manufacturers don't really exist anymore, excluding mobile phones of course. Almost every handheld is a hybrid in the way of the Switch or Steam Deck. Yes, we have the Switch Lite, but there's no mobile-only Switch Lite racing games. However, during the 2000s, the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and the PSP received a large number of their own exclusive racing games, as well as plenty of downgraded ports. The PSP in particular was something of a haven for racing games due to its powerful specs, single joystick, and large display. It's crazy to think that in a decade already pumping out racing games like crazy for consoles, these handheld systems also received numerous dedicated releases of their own. For example, the PSP received 2 amazing Wipeout games, as well as Gran Turismo and Burnout releases tailored towards the system, and so on. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this decade. Were you invested in the racing genre in the 2000s? What were your favorite titles? Is the racing genre just running on fumes in the 2020s? Which franchise would you most like to see make a return? Please remember to hit those subscribe and like buttons, leave a comment, and let's discuss.